Hello, this is Rob Califf. I want to welcome you to this edition of our Health Systems Research Collaboratory Grand Rounds. Today we have with us Laura Dember, who is best known as the PI of the TIME trial, which is getting ready to begin enrollment before too long. And not to be undaunted, Laura has decided in this session to move on to another topic, pragmatic trials for uncommon conditions. With the PCORI national network just getting revved up, this is a very timely topic with 18 patient-powered research networks getting ready to be activated with applications going in today. So really look forward to hearing Laura's ideas and having a good discussion about how to get trials done for uncommon conditions.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So my talk is titled, as you heard, Pragmatic Trials for Uncommon Conditions, and I'm posing this as a question because this model or approach is in quite early stages of exploration and development. So all of the collaboratory demonstration projects that we are getting ready to launch are trials that will enroll a large number of participants who receive care within a small number of health systems or healthcare provider organizations. So lots of patients, small number of health systems. This model works well for diseases or conditions that are common, since there can be sufficient numbers of patients within the small number of participating health systems to provide the required sample size for the trial. The model also works well if the participating health system is very large, and I think the VA system is a great example with its large national patient population and its single electronic medical record. We heard a few months ago during one of these Grand Rounds presentations from Ryan Ferguson about the VA's point-of-care trials that really nicely leverage this. For pragmatic trials conducted within a small number of health systems, many of the challenges center around implementing the interventions without on-site study staff and obtaining data that's of sufficient quality from the electronic medical records. And these are issues that I think all of the demonstration project groups have been focusing a lot of effort on during the past year. So the question that I'd like to pose is, how can we use pragmatic trial approaches to evaluate interventions for diseases or conditions that are not common and therefore not sufficiently represented in a small number of healthcare systems? So why is this important? Well, it's important because many and maybe even most diseases or conditions are not sufficiently represented in a small number of health systems, sufficiently represented to allow large pragmatic trials. And for truly rare conditions, using a small number of health systems is not sufficient even for small trials. If we want to really maximize knowledge generation, a learning health system should accommodate uncommon diseases as well as common diseases. And by uncommon diseases, I'm referring to diseases that are not common. I'm not necessarily referring to diseases that are rare. I'm not sure if that distinction is obvious, but it's important. So I just want to put forth a few caveats for this presentation. I have really only very recently started thinking about pragmatic trials for uncommon conditions. I have a few ideas about this. I have many questions and not many answers. And my intention is really to use this presentation as an opportunity to generate discussion and hear ideas from others who are on the call. I think some of the people on the call have probably been thinking a lot about some of the issues that I'll raise. This topic of implementing pragmatic trials for diseases that are not common is also important within my own field of nephrology. This figure depicts the number of published randomized controlled trials that were performed or published each year between the mid-1960s and 2010 for a variety of medical specialties. Kidney-related RCTs are shown in the green line with the squares, and you can see that as a field, nephrology holds the embarrassing position of conducting the fewest randomized controlled trials. This was the case back in the 1970s and 80s, and it's still the case now. And so while trials really started taking off in most specialties in the late 80s or early 90s, they did not in nephrology. And there are a lot of potential underlying reasons. A major one is probably the historical tremendous emphasis in nephrology on basic science and mechanistic research rather than patient-oriented research during training and in academic centers. But another potential contributor that's more relevant to the topic of today's talk is that there are a large number of causes of kidney disease and a tendency to some extent to split diseases rather than lump diseases when evaluating interventions. So one example to illustrate this is primary glomerulopathies. There are a large number of primary glomerular diseases: minimal change disease, membranous nephropathy, focal segmental glomerulosclerosis, IgA nephropathy. And as a group, these diseases comprise a fairly sizable proportion of the conditions that are treated by nephrologists. But any one of these is pretty uncommon. So it makes sense to split for many treatment trials because of differences in pathogenesis, but this splitting can make it difficult to implement trials efficiently because for many of the kidney diseases, there are not a large number of patients treated at any one center. In addition to the small number of trials, there are a remarkably small number of new drugs that have obtained regulatory approval for the treatment of kidney diseases. Between 2002 and 2012, as far as I can tell, only 4 drugs were approved to treat kidney diseases or diseases that have predominant or prominent kidney manifestations. There are another 5 drugs approved during this period that are not shown in this table that treat complications of kidney disease like anemia or hyperphosphatemia or kidney allograft rejection. But however one looks at this, if we include those or don't, it's still a very small number of new drugs. So there's a lot of concern in nephrology about this and a recognition that new approaches are needed. So I want to talk briefly about one kidney disease, and I'll use this to think about an approach to pragmatic clinical trials that's different from the approach that we've been taking thus far with the Collaboratory trials. Autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease is, as the name implies, a hereditary disorder in which cysts arising from tubular epithelial cells develop and enlarge over many years, replacing the kidney parenchyma and causing loss of kidney function and ultimately end-stage renal disease. The picture of the kidneys shown here is quite typical for this disease. The kidneys have numerous cysts, and the kidneys, because of the growth of these cysts, get markedly enlarged, so that rather than being the size of a human fist, they can be the size of a football. ADPKD affects somewhere between 1 in 400 and 1 in 1,000 individuals, with a prevalence in the United States that's estimated to be about 600,000. The disease is slowly progressive. Most affected people reach end-stage renal disease in their 50s. Importantly, this is well after reproductive age. And it's the 5th leading cause of end-stage renal disease in the United States. There has been substantial progress in understanding the pathogenesis of ADPKD, and the biology of this is really fascinating, and this has led to substantial progress in identifying targets for interventions and also progress in establishing intermediate outcomes for clinical trials. I want to tell you about 2 recent treatment trials or trials of treatments for ADPKD. One of these has been completed, that's the TEMPO trial shown on this slide, and the other is ongoing. The TEMPO trial evaluated a novel treatment for ADPKD, the use of vasopressin B2 receptor antagonist called tolvaptan. This is a drug that you might be familiar with. It's used to treat hyponatremia in hospitalized patients. And there's a large body of experimental work implicating activation of the D2 receptor and cyst growth. So this was a double-blind, placebo-controlled trial. The primary outcome was the annual rate of change in total kidney volume assessed by MRI. This is one of those intermediate outcomes that's been recently validated as an indicator of clinical outcomes. 1,445 patients were enrolled from 129 sites in 15 countries. took 2 years to enroll the target number, and the follow-up for each participant was 3 years. This was an industry-sponsored trial. And the results were published last year in the New England Journal of Medicine. The tolvaptan group had slower kidney growth and slower loss of kidney function. There were some issues with tolerability of the drug, and there is a liver toxicity that seems to be emerging, and it's not yet clear whether the drug will be approved by the FDA at this point. So on this slide, I show the other large trial for ADPKD. And this is really 2 trials that are being conducted concurrently, both evaluating intensive inhibition of the renin-angiotensin system in either early disease, which is the study for early disease is called Study A, and later disease, which is Study B. Study A uses a factorial design, so in addition to evaluating ACE inhibition plus angiotensin receptor blockers versus ACE inhibition alone, it also evaluates 2 different blood pressure targets. Study B is only looking at ACE plus ARB versus ACE inhibitor alone. The outcomes for studies A and B are different. In the early trial, the outcome is similar to that was used in the TEMPO trial, a change in kidney volume by MRI. In Study B, for later stage disease, the outcome is a composite of time to 50% reduction in EGFR and development of end-stage renal disease or death. These trials have completed enrollment. 548 patients have been enrolled into Study A. 470 patients were enrolled in Study B. And the enrollment was completed in 3 years, which was 1 year longer than had been anticipated when the trial was designed. The whole PKD trials are NIH-sponsored, and they're being conducted at 7 centers. These are centers of excellence. They're major referral centers that have a specific interest in ADPKD. In thinking about these 2 trials and comparing them, I want to make a few points. The TEMPO trial studied a novel agent, not something that had previously, that was in use for this disease. In contrast, the interventions evaluated in the whole PKD trials, or that are being evaluated in the whole PKD trials, are used frequently in this population, although not always in combination. The TEMPO trial had a very large number of centers, 129 centers, and most of these centers did not have particular expertise in ADPKD. And just want to make the point that most patients with ADPKD are treated by community nephrologists. The whole PKD trials had a small number of sites, 7 centers, and as I said before, these were centers of excellence. The average number of participants per center was 11 in the TEMPO trial, and for each of the whole PKD trials, it's about 70 per center. If we look only at the whole PKD Study A, which had very similar eligibility criteria as the TEMPO trial, they were both for early stage disease, the enrollment into whole PKD took 50% longer, 3 years rather than 2, to enroll substantially fewer patients, about 40% of the number of patients as were enrolled in the TEMPO trial. So I want you to keep these trials in mind, and I will return to them a bit later in the talk. Okay, so I want to return to the question that I posed earlier. How can we use pragmatic trial approaches to evaluate interventions for diseases or conditions that are not common and not sufficiently represented in a small number of healthcare systems? So I think what we need to be able to do is recruit patients, consent patients, implement the intervention, collect data, assess safety at a large number of sites without having on-site research teams, without relying on site-specific electronic communication systems or tracking systems, without relying on site-specific electronic medical records. So in trials that are conducted in a small number of healthcare systems, like we're doing in the Collaboratory demonstration projects, we can rely on site-specific systems, electronic systems, records and data systems, because the number of systems is small. Even if there are a lot of physical sites or multiple practices, since the systems are standardized throughout the healthcare system, there are not a large number of data and medical record systems to have to deal with. But if a trial needs to be implemented across many healthcare systems that utilize it has to be implemented across many healthcare systems, utilizing electronic data systems would not be feasible because there would be so many different systems. So what I'd like to argue is that to implement efficient real-world pragmatic trials across a large number of sites that belong to many different health systems, we need to consider a patient-driven rather than investigator-driven approach to implementation. So what does this mean? Well, in an investigator-driven approach, which is what we are used to with traditional models like the TEMPO trial or the whole PKD trial, the investigator seeks out patients for enrollment, implements the intervention, and collects data during follow-up. This requires substantial investigator effort, which limits the number of sites that can be used for enrollment, and with a limited number of sites, there's less accessibility of the trial to patients. But if we think about a patient-driven approach, this is an approach where, and I think this is a potential approach for conducting pragmatic trials across many different health systems. In this approach, it's the patient who approaches the treating physician and provides the physician with information about the trial. And then the physician implements the intervention and follows the patient. So a patient-driven model that I've just described requires highly informed and highly motivated patients. It requires willing physicians and mechanisms for data capture and transmission. And a patient-driven trial, I think, probably would restrict interventions to those for which there is a high level of physician experience and comfort. However, the patient, really self-identifies as a potential participant and brings the trial to the clinical care site, in contrast to what we're used to, where the site is seeking out the patient. So some of the key components for any clinical trial are shown here. And in thinking about a patient-driven trial implementation approach, we obviously need to consider all of the usual components of a clinical trial. So in thinking about recruitment for a patient-driven trial implementation, there are many potential sources for recruiting patients, some of which would work better for certain diseases than others. I think some of these are particularly well developed and utilized for very rare diseases. But, there are patient contact registries, social networking websites, patient advocacy groups, Wikipedia is a place where information about trials is potentially posted, and a study website with a lot of attention to using strategies to make the website a preferred site that comes up during searches. On this slide, I've provided sort of potential approaches to informed consent, eligibility determination, adherence monitoring, adverse event reporting. And there are probably many other approaches. I'm just trying to provide some kind of theoretical examples. So for consent, a patient could provide internet-based consent and internet-based demonstration of understanding of the consent, and this approach has been used in trials, and it's being used within the Collaboratory in Gary Rosenthal's trial. For determining eligibility seems a little tricky to me, but I think it's doable. This probably requires verification of eligibility by the treating physician and a process by which the physician could submit this verification to the study team, presumably via the internet. Adherence data could potentially be provided by the patient via the internet, triggered by reminders. Adverse event reporting, again, is another tricky one. Would patient-reported adverse events be acceptable? Is that enough? I think this probably depends on the intervention. And then for outcome ascertainment, well, it's for patient-reported outcomes, this is a perfect approach. We talked in the Collaboratory about the challenges of getting patient-reported outcomes implemented in the clinical care setting, but in a patient-driven implementation model, there's no need to rely on the clinical care setting. For other outcome data, this might or might not require action by the treating physician. So periodically, a patient could either request certain data elements from his treating physician, or as patients are starting to gain more and more access to their own records, the patients could potentially be responsible for transmitting their data to the study. This sounds quite challenging, but there is this momentum building for easy access to one's health records, and there are systems being developed for anonymizing records. This, I think, will get easier and easier. I think it will get easier and easier for patients to download their electronic health records for their own use and for transmission to others. So I don't know a lot about this, and I'm hoping, I think there are people potentially on the call who can tell us more about this during the discussion period, about these systems for patients accessing their own data, de-identifying it, and transmitting it. So I'll now return to the two ADPKD trials that I described earlier and ask the question whether either of these trials could have been conducted using a patient-driven implementation model. As I said earlier, these trials, these patient-driven trials, only work if patients are well-informed and have access to information about the trial. So for ADPKD, are patients highly informed? And I think the answer to this is yes. In ADPKD, there's a tremendous penetrance of support groups, foundations, there are patient registries. So I think this would not be a roadblock for either the TEMPO trial or the HALT-PKD trial. Are the patients highly motivated? A lot is required of them in patient-driven model, maybe the least of which is the intervention itself. But I think the answer to this question is yes. ADPKD has a lot of very motivated patients. This is a disease of families. Patients with the disease have seen typically they've seen multiple family members with this illness, and they worry about their children. So I think it is a very highly motivated group of patients on the whole. Is it likely that physicians, the treating physicians, in this case nephrologists, would be comfortable administering the intervention since they would need to do this? I think for the TEMPO trial, for tolvaptan's intervention, the answer is no. This is a new agent. It's not previously used for polycystic kidney disease. But for the HALT-PKD trials, ACE inhibition, angiotensin receptor blockers, managing blood pressure, this is really the bread and butter of nephrology. So I think treating physician comfort with implementing the intervention would be high. What about mechanisms for data capture and data transmission? For the TEMPO trial, this was a non-approved drug. The trial was being done to support regulatory approval, so I think the answer is no, that there probably are not adequate mechanisms to transmit the data necessary for a trial like that. But for whole PKD, this probably could work if there are the right systems in place. And then, are the outcomes suitable? Can they be obtained from care that's delivered anywhere rather than at specialized study sites? So the TEMPO trial and Study A in the whole PKD trials used kidney volume by MRI as the primary outcome, and this is probably not an outcome that would work well in a patient-driven trial. But Study B, which was for the more advanced PKD, the outcome incorporated estimated GFR, end-stage renal disease, and death, and this is an outcome that I think would work for a patient-driven trial. So if we think about this whole PKD trial and how it might differ from an investigator-driven trial, if the whole PKD trial were patient-driven, I don't really have answers to these questions, but I think it's reasonable to posit that there would be more rapid enrollment if one could have this implemented in a very large number of nephrology practices. There could be larger sample size, which could allow shorter follow-up. I don't think I pointed it out, but the average follow-up for the whole PKD Study B was 6.5 years. It could probably, although I'm not sure of this, be implemented at a lower cost. The implementation of the intervention would be less tightly regulated than an investigator-driven trial. This is true for pragmatic trials in general, not just patient-driven pragmatic trials. Data collection in the patient-driven model would likely be more parsimonious. And I think a big question is whether this patient-driven approach would achieve or allow for adequate monitoring of safety, since the monitoring is, very dependent on the actions of the treating physicians. So to summarize, health system-centered pragmatic trials work well for diseases or conditions that are highly prevalent, but not for diseases that are not highly prevalent. Patient-driven pragmatic trials require highly motivated patients and interventions for which there is a high level of physician comfort. However, because they are not dependent on the health system's infrastructure or IT systems, patient-driven trials can be implemented across a potentially limitless number of settings, allowing evaluation of interventions for diseases with lower prevalence. So I will stop here and look forward to people's comments, questions.
Laura, that was great, and it gets right into the heart of issues that I think many of us are either struggling with or wondering about. I notice you have one written question. I have a host of questions and some people to call on here who I think will have a lot of interesting perspective on this. But I see Tracy Locklear has a question about tightly controlled implementation. Can you see it?
Yeah, I see it. So the question is, less tightly controlled implementation of intervention. Can you expand on this? Does this interfere with the quality of the data? So what I was referring to was, in a typical investigator-driven trial that's using sort of the more of the explanatory model that rather than a pragmatic model, there's often a lot of opportunity for very controlled implementation of the intervention. By controlled, I mean, rigorous adherence to a very strict protocol. Whereas in pragmatic trials in general, and in this sort of potential model of patient-driven pragmatic trials, a lot would be left to treating physicians. There wouldn't be the opportunity for all of the oversight, and the physicians would not be following a very complex protocol that might be used for other types of trials. I'm not sure if that answered the question, but the second part of that, does this interfere with the quality of the data? I don't think it necessarily, I think there are issues with quality of the data with pragmatic trials in general. I think here the biggest impact, I think this is more of a real-world implementation and would answer the question about how, in the real world, treating physicians would implement a similar intervention. So I'm not sure it really, I have to think about it a little bit, but I don't think it's as much a data quality issue as how the intervention is implemented. So I see a question from Jerry Jarvik that says, have you thought much about the potential for bias using a patient-driven approach, given that these patients are likely to be different, highly motivated and highly informed than the typical patient for many conditions? Yeah, I think that's absolutely an issue, and probably should have made that point in the presentation, that the generalizability, so we talk about pragmatic trials as being much more highly generalizable, but in this case, one would need to interpret the results as relevant to a highly motivated, highly informed patient who was willing to take on this role and responsibility. Okay, so then I see a question from Barry Collar. Are you concerned that the population studied, this is really addressing the same issue. Are you concerned that the population studied will not be representative of the entire population, since patients who are not as well connected electronically may be underrepresented? Absolutely, yeah, that's definitely an issue.
All right, I have a number of questions, and I'll just preface it by saying, obviously there are a lot of interesting variations on this theme that are evolving, ranging from very patient-driven groups like the Multiple Myeloma Research Foundation or the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, which really have seized control of the agenda, the research agenda for their diseases for the most part, all the way out to patients like me and 23andMe, which are in their wildest form, we're talking about doing randomized trials entirely independently of the health systems, bypassing all of what they see as an impeding bureaucracy that we put into place to make it almost impossible to answer critical questions. But and I think over the course of the remaining time we can talk more about that. But I wanted to see if we could unmute Rachel Florence, who's just put out, in fact, looking at responses coming in today from the patient-powered research networks, which is, I understand them, are intended to do a large part of what you described here. Rachel, can maybe give the group an overview? I know in a while you and Joe Selby will be doing one of our grand rounds, but it would probably be good to sort of chime in your reaction to Laura's ideas and also a little bit of perspective on what you're hoping for from the PPRNs.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep. So I mean, I think several comments, and I can perhaps start by addressing the discussion that went on about generalizability. So I think that it's definitely a concern. It was definitely a concern to us as we were setting up the PPRNs, which are the patient-powered research networks, and the CBRNs. And I think part of our way or our hope in sort of addressing the generalizability issue was that the patient-powered networks would integrate in some ways with the clinical data research network, so that we would be able to address some of these generalizability issues. So that it wouldn't just be the activated group of patients, but it would also be other patients sharing that condition in the wider health systems. So that was one thing. And then the second thing that we've asked of our patient-powered networks is that, yes, in the beginning they do come in as activated groups of patients that are part of patient organizations and patient registries working with researchers. But part of our ask to them over the 18 months is to be reaching out to other patients with that condition, so that it's not just the activated and motivated group that enters the research or the pragmatic trial, but they also have an outreach job to do. So these were just sort of two quick comments on just the initial conversation that took place. I mean, I'd say otherwise sort of more big picture is that certainly the presentation does, sort of hit on the head a lot of the things that we're hoping to achieve with the patient-powered network. So just the ability to answer questions that matter to patients, and then so engage patients more highly and more cost-effectively in research. I think another piece that we will need to think about is, it's one thing to engage the patients, but then it's another to engage both the providers and the health systems in that enterprise, and then work through a number of the issues that you've mentioned and highlighted here, including the consent and the ethical oversight issue. So these are things that come January. I think we're hoping to really sort of have a laboratory to really sort of in practice work through some of these and come up with some solutions.
Now, Laura, I see you've had some questions from some people who have been involved in these trials, but before we get there, I wonder if you might comment, and particularly something that we've been discussing a little bit as we're preparing for the PCORI Coordinating Center effort, is I wonder if the trials are more patient-powered or driven by the patients, as you put it, Laura, would the questions be the same? Do you think the design of the two trials you mentioned would look the same if the patients were really sort of in control, I guess, would be the question.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question and something I didn't address at all in this. I think I think as Rachel pointed out, what matters to patients is not always what physicians think matters. So the outcomes might be different. I was not involved in either of these trials, so in terms of whether there were patient-reported outcomes, I'm not sure, although Kathleen Myers was involved in the PKD HALT trial, so she might be able to comment on that. Interventions might be different. I do think, and maybe Kathy knows this as well, I do think that for autosomal dominant polycystic kidney disease, the patient support groups and advocacy groups are really highly engaged with the kind of research community. So this is me just completely guessing, but Kathy might be able to answer. I would bet that there was some input when these trials were designed, but I don't know that. I don't know. Should we unmute Kathy and see if she has comments?
Yeah.
She put in a comment here about the whole trial.
Yeah,
I know. Hear me?
Yes.
Oh, very good. Yeah, I guess so several issues that you brought up. I suppose the first one, which is your last question, Rob, about whether interventions would be different. And I suspect, yes, for highly motivated and educated and very interested patients, which I think really does describe the ADPKD population in the U.S., there was quite a bit of discussion and discomfort amongst some of the patients about willingness to be randomized to different blood pressure targets. There was sort of many patients who really had a preference for being kept at a much lower blood pressure target, and there was some resistance initially to being randomized to what was considered, a normal blood pressure range. So there were interesting discussions and impressions that many of the patients had about the interventions early on. It was quite interesting. But the efforts of the PKD Foundation are tireless in really providing information to patients with the disorder and a very grassroots approach in local chapters. They're very impressive. I guess the comment that I had written earlier about the impact of a more patient-driven process, and there are several of the ADPKD clinical investigators in the U.S. who've been involved in a number of NIH-supported efforts, and I do remember discussions like this where everyone kind of had a what if we could really engage patients in this process, because They were very effectively lobbying the government and NIH to support more trials in this area. And yet, as enrollment was launched at just, several of these regional centers, there was an initial ramp up, and then once sort of the resident patients were exhausted and enrolled into the studies, it was hard for these regional centers of excellence to reach out to even local community docs who, as Laura suggested, are seeing, the lion's share of these people are out in the community with their nephrologists. It was very hard to reach out. There were barriers that, we couldn't get these patients referred, and there was really quite an unwillingness to bring people in. Part of that was the complexity and the length of the protocol, and so they turned out to be real obstacles, and it obviously took much longer to get to enrollment targets than anticipated. But I do, at the beginning, several of the investigators did have this discussion about how can we really engage patients, because we knew there was tremendous amount of interest in getting enrolled into the trials.
Well, Kathy, this sort of gets back to the patients like me or 23andMe approach, which I think you're alluding to, and I'm interested in Laura's view as a nephrologist, and maybe Rob Starr will want to opine about this. Also, obviously this is limited to nephrology, but it's just a case that you were talking about that it's almost as if, in fact, recent polling data that I think everyone's seen from Research America indicated that most Americans would willingly participate in a clinical trial if their doctor thought it was a good thing to do. What you're alluding to is that when you designate regional centers and give them the money, it's pretty hard often to get the doctors out there to want to participate. Maybe it's the money, but maybe it's just not believing in clinical trials. I don't know. So some groups, and certainly if you look at the fabric of the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, it's really telling the doctors to either participate or will advise the families to take their loved ones elsewhere for clinical care, because we've got to get the answer to these questions and have high quality. So, Laura, I know in dialysis it's a pretty focal group of doctors in particular centers, but in the broader nephrology world, there are probably a lot of different kinds of docs, and as you said, primary care plays a big role. So how do you digitate these two things?
Yeah, that's an important point. As you were talking, I was thinking about, it's hard to potentially get community physicians to refer their patients to centers of excellence for trial participation. But I wonder if it would be very different with the patient-driven approach where, what I was sort of trying to describe and envision was the patient learns about the trial through the support groups and internet and social media and comes to his or her physician and says, here's information, hands-on information about the trial. This is what I want to do, and I would like you to help me participate in this by following these, presumably a fairly simple intervention by, I'll get randomized to ACE inhibitor alone or ACE inhibitor plus ARB. These are drugs you're comfortable using in all kinds of your patients all the time. And, will you help me participate in this trial by doing what it takes on the physician side, and I'll do the lion's share of the work, assuming the systems are in place for that. And I just wonder if the perspective would be very different when it's the patient coming to his doctor saying, help me do this, rather than the academic medical center 10 miles away saying, please send your patient to us, and we'll see them frequently to make sure the complex protocol is adhered to, and the nephrologist in the community saying, no thanks.
I wonder if we could hear from Rob Starr about his viewpoint on what's been said so far. So, you're having to think about this a lot in terms of what you find. Yeah, we can hear you, Rob.
Yeah, I think this is a really lovely idea. The other people are worried about the patient population not being similar to the rest of the United States. but the adherence rate may actually be more similar to what happens in practice than what happens in a clinical trial. But that means that the statistics will need to be adjusted to make sure that power is correct. I had one question also. Maybe there's some populations where this would be easier to carry out than others that are pediatric. I don't know what people think. That was question one. Question two is the research coordinators often convince patients to stay on protocol. How often do people think that happens? That would not happen here.
Yeah, so I actually couldn't hear the first question, but I did hear the second question, and it's what's written on the site. And I think what would happen to, that what should be incorporated into these is interaction. There would somehow be interaction via the internet potentially between the participant and the study team. And if it's evident that the patient is not doing what's supposed to be done, providing the data, taking the meds, because incorporated into this could be adherence reports by the patient. I don't know if a relationship over the internet isn't nearly as effective as a relationship with a human study coordinator, but it seems like something worth putting some effort into, and maybe it could accomplish more than we might think. Go ahead. One of the I'm going to just raise a question because I don't know if there are people on the call, but one of the big questions in my mind is the systems that exist. Will they allow for patients to get their own electronic health records and submit them potentially to a trial data coordinating center, for example? And I think there's a lot of interest in making this happen, but I don't have a great sense of where things are, and I wonder if anyone's on the call has a sense of that.
Well, I can start from at least what I've learned so far is it would be pretty difficult. Right now, the records belong to the systems. It's hard enough to get them in common form when you have people who are paid to curate the data between two systems. But this, of course, doesn't mean we couldn't reach a tipping point where this really begins to happen. And you might argue that the most effective place to do it would be where you have registries already set up. And I think, cystic fibrosis and multiple myeloma are places where that essentially is unnecessary because the patients and doctors are sharing the same systems, but we don't have that many that are like that yet. Rachel, I don't know if you could comment from what PCORI has learned so far. I haven't gotten this deeply into it.
Yeah, so I'm certainly not an expert in this, but we have been talking to some of the folks over at ONC and talking about the Blue Button Initiative, which was created out of the VA, and which is a way for the data to be transmitted from a provider to a patient. And my understanding is that the Meaningful Use 2 does have a provision for patients being able to require or request their electronic health record, or actually I think it's their clinical care, their CCDA document. My understanding is that technically we're on the verge of this being possible in terms of transmitting the data. But for the purposes of research, the real sort of problem is having the data in a form that's then really usable and analyzable for research. But I think that technically we're sort of getting there where there is technology and there's some policies whereby patients could require some of their electronic health record data to be transmitted to them.
Yeah, I think the point you're making, which I've heard Jeff Brown and Rich Platt say several times, is what you get through the blue button is what went into the record, which is a lot of different stuff and not in a research-ready format. So it would present, if that all got downloaded, it would be hard to swallow from the perspective of the research database. But again, over time, it seems like things are headed in the right direction, as you say. Eric Larson, I wonder if you have a comment on this from the point of view of acceptability and getting access to records. And I know you've been working in systems that have been very interactive between the patients and the practitioners.
Yeah, and I just had a meeting at the IOM with a group talking about, how eventually the records are going to be regulated in such a way that they're probably going to be increasingly useful for standard information through meaningful use. So that's going to be, I think, very valuable for researchers. What we know is that there's quite a lot of variability in what is releasable, but that once you get through the issue around consent and agree that a patient's electronic health record is available, I think there's not much of a hurdle other than to begin to do some work to actually verify that the information you're getting is good enough for research. And I know that almost everybody in the Collaboratory is doing that already. But we find, for example, that a variable like, let's say, statin myopathy for genetic studies, if you begin to look at what seems like a logical a way to find those cases, and you actually go in and do formal chart review to avoid the work to think you can avoid the work of actually looking at a chart or talking to a patient, some variables just don't work. So I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Rob, but to me, one of the key issues here as we begin to use electronic health records for research is to not only overcome the issue of data sharing with researchers, but also vetting the data for the quality. Is it really, do we really know what we're measuring? And ultimately, I think that's going to be the next frontier.
Eric, let me ask you what I think may be a tough question, but you usually answer my tough questions by reframing it in a way which shows I didn't really understand what I was asking. So here we have a not common disease. Probably if we looked at the health systems you've been working in, this particular disease would not be a high priority relative to the big issues that the health system faces that drive the way administrators and system leaders think. So if someone came to you and said, we want to do this randomized trial with individual patient randomization, would the health system have any way of prioritizing this trial relative to everything else that it's doing?
I don't know that most health systems would have a way of prioritizing it. I don't know that a place like Group Health would today. But I think a health system like Group Health, and I think many others, there's a strong commitment to wanting to improve healthcare through research. So I think the way I would take that question, and it happens probably a couple times a month, is not so much how would we prioritize it, but how would we answer the question about how feasible is it for our health system to partner with you, Professor so-and-so, or Assistant Professor so-and-so, in identifying and participating in a clinical trial, and at the same time fulfilling our basic responsibility of running the business and taking good care of our patients. It's the interface between the trial and the patient care that I think is the critical one for health systems. And if you can solve that in a way that is beneficial for all parties, and I don't think it's that hard to do in most cases, you've got the basis for the priority of the question driving the institution's interest in prioritizing this particular trial?
So just my prediction as we get deeper into this over the next few years is that's going to be a big issue for NIH and industry for the more sort of therapeutic-driven trials as opposed to the system policy trials, which seem to fit better. But I think it's a great challenge to have. And maybe with that, I'll call on Josie Briggs, who has a question on comment.
Can I fly my question back at you? Did my response make sense?
It did make sense in a very general way, Eric, but I having approached a lot of health systems with individual patient randomized trials, I think it's becoming harder and harder to meet the other obligations that you mentioned two big ones, run the business, which I think is actually the dominant issue now when it comes to these things. And, if a protocol involves too much detail, which I'll bet both of these protocols that Laura mentioned had a lot of measurements. Just getting a research quality MRI is something that would take a lot of time, and it's hard to cover the cost in the American system. I think the details are actually getting more difficult and not less because the pressure on those two responsibilities is greater. It used to be you could, as a practitioner, you could sort of segregate out some time and just do it. And now there's somebody looking at almost every second you spend. Do you agree that it's a tough nut?
Right. The presumption is that the resources, you get paid to do what you get paid to do, and you do that, and then somebody does have to pay for the time. If it is a research MRI, I don't think any system today is going to easily be able to just add that to their cost of doing business.
Yeah. So, Josie, maybe you can take the last.
Well, this conversation you've been having with Eric is totally fascinating to me. I've been thinking a lot about and learning from these specific projects how and what kind of questions can we get this kind of terrific partnership with healthcare systems. It's really critical. But anyway, my comment was just scratching my memory about the early phases of HALT PKD and remembering that we were competing with tolvaptan studies and that there was a real buzz around tolvaptan among both physicians and patients and a real hope that tolvaptan was going to dramatically slow cyst growth, which it really doesn't. It maybe it has some impact, but it's modest. And the fact that HALT PKD was kind of a how do we best manage this condition and does more for complete renin-angiotensin system blockade, for which there was some biological arguments, does that help with slowing cyst growth? So, I think that patients and docs often are primarily interested in what's going to make a dramatic difference in the course of disease. That's just my memory. Anyway, it's a great session, Rob.
Thanks. Laura, I wonder, in closing, could you just comment on how many people in the U.S. have the disease?
It's estimated to be 600,000. So it's, it's not a rare disease by the, NIH definition of less than 200,000, but I would say it's not a common disease like hypertension.
So my great hope.
I intentionally didn't take numbers. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, Go ahead.
No, I just intentionally did not pick a really rare disease because I wanted to be kind of somewhere in the middle.
My great hope is that we can crack this case, because if you think about what Josie just said, which is there were two competing protocols looking for a total of just over 2,000 people, and we have 600,000 people with a disease. Now, for sure, almost all of them have electronic medical records, and if we were organized and could curate the data correctly, could be located and communicated with. And the fact that we're having to sweat it out over competition for 2,000 of the 600,000 maybe gives us a target to shoot for. But, Laura, I think you really stimulated a great discussion, and I'm sure that we'll have many more about this topic. So thanks, everybody, and we look forward to hearing from you next week.